Good morning. I hope everyone's doing well. I'm going to pick up where I left off with video number 2 within the Chapter 7 series of 3. We're going to talk about the actual process of cellular respiration in this video. So the overall process of cellular respiration. Glucose is going to be one of our reactants. It is going to be oxidized. So oxygen is going to be used and carbon dioxide is going to be released. The oxygen is going to pick up the hydrogen atoms that are released from glucose at the end of respiration to form water. And there's going to be a little bit of energy capture. That's called ATP. The remaining energy that's released is referred to as thermal energy or heat. This is referred to as an oxidation reduction or a redox reaction, which I'll explain better in the next slide. Exergonic reactions release energy, and you see the two forms of energy released in respiration. Chemical energy of ATP and thermal energy of heat. The catabolic nature of this reaction is the breaking down of the organic molecule glucose as what we're using as the reactant. You will notice when we go over photosynthesis that basically the process is reversed. So I wanted to explain a little bit better this redox reaction, oxidation and reduction. Oxidation is when a molecule loses hydrogen atoms or ions or electrons. So glucose is oxidized in respiration, so it loses its hydrogen atoms, and the resultant product is carbon dioxide. Look at the pinkish red arrow in the lower right corner of the figure. Reduction is the gain of hydrogen atoms, the proton and electron, if you will, by a molecule. So look at the light blue arrow. Oxygen is reduced to form water in respiration. The resultant release of energy is captured as ATP and also as heat. We will talk a little bit about glycolysis, the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, and electron transport chain, the 3 steps in respiration. Just note with this slide that respiration begins in the cytoplasm, and if oxygen is present, it will finish up within the organelle called the mitochondrion. So let's start with the first stage of respiration, glycolysis. Glycolysis refers to the splitting of glucose. So glucose is typically your most commonly used carbohydrate in respiration. Think of blood glucose levels, think of A1C levels, insulin levels, and so forth that are measured if you go to the doctor. So glucose, very common carbohydrate, primary source of energy in not only humans and other animals, but also plants. So in the cytoplasm, in an environment where oxygen can be lacking, called anaerobic, glucose is split to form 2 molecules of pyruvate or pyruvic acid. The first steps of glycolysis do require 2 molecules of ATP that end up about midway with the splitting of the initial glucose molecule and 2 molecules of what is called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. The remaining steps of glycolysis are energy harvesting steps where 4 molecules of ATP are produced. So the net gain of ATP is 2. molecules by glycolysis. The final product of this 10-step reaction is pyruvate, 2 molecules of pyruvate. So glycolysis is linear in nature. It does not require oxygen. It splits glucose into 2 molecules of pyruvate. It removes a few atoms of hydrogen, and they are picked up by an electron carrier molecule that's called NAD, as you see right in the middle of the linear pathway. So once pyruvate is formed, it will then be transported into the cytoplasm if oxygen is present. Please forgive me, it will be transported into the mitochondrion if oxygen is present. If oxygen is absent, then further steps called fermentation may occur. The Krebs cycle was named for Hans Krebs, who kind of discovered this cycle in the 1960s. We have kind of gotten into a tradition now of not naming chemical pathways after people, so a more appropriate name for this process is the citric acid cycle. So pyruvate will move through a transport protein in the membrane of the mitochondrion and move into the matrix. It will be first converted into a smaller molecule called acetyl or acetyl coenzyme A. A molecule of carbon dioxide will be released. Then this acetyl coenzyme A will bond to oxaloacetate, to form citric acid or citrate. So the first formed molecule in this cycle is citrate or citric acid. The cycle turns. Carbon dioxide is released at several steps. Hydrogen atoms are released in several steps. In one step, there is the production of ATP. So at the end of the Krebs cycle, the initial glucose is completely oxidized. 6 molecules of carbon dioxide can be released, and all of the 12 atoms of hydrogen have been removed from the initial glucose. These atoms of hydrogen have been picked up by nucleotides that are called electron carriers. So step 1 is glycolysis, the splitting of the glucose into pyruvate. Step 2 is the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. That is basically the cyclical process where the sugar is completely oxidized. So carbon dioxide is formed and the hydrogen atoms have all been removed. Step 3, when we get to it, is the use of this hydrogen to produce ATP. So at the end of the Krebs cycle, there have been a total of 4 ATP molecules produced. Hydrogen atoms do not just float about in the cytoplasm. They are picked up by organic molecules. They're actually called nucleotides, and they're also called coenzymes because they can help a protein enzyme actually function. So the 2 electron carriers in respiration are called NAD and FADH. So look at the pronunciation of the names here. Nicotinamide dinucleotide, NAD. FADH, flavine adenine dinucleotide. So each one of these electron carriers accepts hydrogen atoms and carries them to the 3rd stage of respiration, which is called electron transport chain. The 3rd step of respiration is called electron transport chain or electron transport phosphorylation. It occurs in the very highly folded inner membrane of the mitochondrion. I ask you, look at the figure. The electron carriers, NAD and FAD, they release hydrogen ions and electrons to a series of proteins. They're shaded in light blue. The proteins release the hydrogen ions into the space between the two membranes of the mitochondrion, called the inner membrane space. The electrons are transported through these different proteins. You notice they are numbered 1, 2, 3, cytochrome C, and then 4. These electrons pass through these proteins in the inner membrane. The hydrogen ions build up in concentration in this intermembrane space. The concentration of hydrogen ions becomes very high. It sets up a concentration gradient, and the hydrogen ions then flow back into the matrix of the mitochondrion, the cytoplasm. They flow through an enzyme called ATP synthase, and the energy that is produced by this movement of these hydrogen ions is enough to actually cause a bond to form between ADP and inorganic phosphate. So you see the production of ATP. The final step, if you will, in respiration is the production of water. Oxygen will accept hydrogen ions and the associated electrons that flow through the membrane proteins to form water. So you notice that one atom of oxygen will accept 2 hydrogen atoms and associated electrons to form water at the end of electron transport chain. So this is the money step in respiration. It generates by far the largest amount of ATP. Anywhere from 26 to 28 molecules are thought to be generated. In respiration, there is the production of ATP in several different places. One is called substrate level, where ATP forms during the actual chemical pathway. There are 4 molecules of ATP formed, 2 in glycolysis and 2 in the citric acid cycle. The majority of ATP formed in respiration is formed during electron transport chain, and it is referred to as oxidative phosphorylation. That is ATP formed from the release of hydrogen atoms and electrons and the flow of hydrogen ions and electrons back and forth across the inner membrane. We refer to this movement of ions through the inner membrane as chemiosmosis. So the ions flow from the inner membrane space back to the matrix, and that generates energy called ATP. The net energy harvest from aerobic respiration is somewhere between 30 or 32 molecules of ATP. It just depends on prokaryote versus eukaryote, the movement of organic molecules across membranes that may cost energy as well. So the total energy that is captured is somewhere around 32 to 34%. The remaining energy from this initial glucose molecule is released as thermal energy or heat. So you see about 66 to 68% of the energy being released as heat. So from the thermodynamics portion of chapter 6, energy is always conserved. So the amount of energy is the same at the end of respiration, but the energy quality is not as good. 32 to 34% is the quality. So thank you, and have a great day.